Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and we're back again with one of our mini episodes, another quick hit for you, quick introduction to a key mental model that you're going to need to accelerate your learning speed in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So this is the third of the core mechanics of jiu-jitsu that we want to talk about. In the past two mini episodes, we talked about frames and levers. This time we're going to talk about wedges. Now, if you're not familiar with wedges in the context of jiu-jitsu, we are not talking about pizza here. We're talking about a really important tool for either immobilizing your opponent or breaking through their defenses. So let's talk about how this works. Broadly speaking, there's two different types of wedges that you can deploy in jiu-jitsu. The first is a blocking wedge, and the second is a prying wedge. So let's give some examples of these. A blocking wedge is like a doorstop. A doorstop is actually a great example of a wedge. It is literally a wedge that you use to block something. And much like with the doorstop, in jiu-jitsu, when you use a blocking wedge, you are trying to block your opponent's movement and immobilize part of their body. A really good example of this, think about when you're on top of someone inside control and you're trying to hold them in position. If you don't prevent them from moving around, it can be very difficult to pin them there. So a lot of what you're doing with your arms and your legs when you're holding someone inside control is using wedges to prevent their movement. You're trying to put obstacles next to their head or next to their hips so that they can't move. For example, the shoulder of justice, where you drive your shoulder into someone's face from side control, that's putting a wedge into their face so they can't turn towards you. If you put your hand down by their hip or you bring your knee up by their hip so they can't re-guard, that's another wedge. You've created an obstacle. Wedges are tremendously important when you're going on the offensive, especially when you're trying to secure and hold a position. Wedges are often the things that take away your opponent's ability to move around, and their ability to move around is going to be a key to how they defend and get out of that bad position. So whenever you're trying to secure a dominant position, always think, what wedges do I have here to block their movement? And what you'll see is in most positions, there's always going to be something there that you can use to wedge them in place. So in the context of top side control, we talked about how you might be using your shoulder or your hands to prevent their head from moving. Or maybe you're using your hands or your knees to prevent their hips from moving. But you could also be talking about mount, for example. In mount, when you use your feet to hook underneath their butt, you're creating wedges. You're making it hard for them to free their legs. If you're into leg entanglements, when you're playing a position like the 411, saddle, honey hole, a big part of what you're doing is you're using your legs as a scissor to wedge their leg in place. So wedges are a very important way to deny your opponent the ability to move, and that immobilization is so key when you're going on the attack against them. Now that said, there's no rule saying that a wedge has to be used offensively, but most of the time, a wedge is going to be an offensive tool because you're trying to hold them in place while you do something. The second type of wedge is a prying wedge. So a blocking wedge is like a doorstop where you're trying to prevent something from moving. A prying wedge is like a crowbar where you're trying to break something open. And that is also very important in jiu-jitsu, and again, especially important when you're going on the attack. So if you remember in the prior episode, we talked about how if someone's got frames up, one of your options is to try to get leverage on those frames to turn those frames into levers. Another option is to use a prying wedge to just bust through those frames. And if you think in jiu-jitsu, you can probably come up with some good examples of prying wedges in action. A very obvious example of a prying wedge is the knee cut pass. You're using your knee as a giant wedge to pry the person's guard open so they can't close it again. There's also a lot of other types of wedges that you can do if you want to lock your opponent's hips open. So for instance, let's say that I'm trying to do some sort of pass that involves me splitting your legs open and locking your hips in an open position. There's a type of stack pass called the split stack pass that friend of the show Beatrice Jin uses. That's a great example of a move like this. You're prying the person's legs apart and you don't want to let them close them again. You would do that by using part of your body as a wedge. Or similarly, if you're trying to do a traditional stack pass and you want to force their legs to stay closed, you might put a blocking wedge on both sides. That's why with a traditional stack pass, you've got your arms around the outside and you're trying to prevent them from opening their legs, because once they reestablish hip mobility, it's a lot easier for them to get out. So generally there's two different ways that you can use wedges in jiu-jitsu: a blocking wedge for immobilizing, or a prying wedge for breaking open a frame. Again, both of these are very important tools at your disposal. And part of the reason I'm having these mini episodes and I'm explaining this is because when you start to think of jiu-jitsu in terms of these core mechanics, it makes understanding moves and why they work a lot easier. It'll get to the point where you start looking at techniques and you're able in your mind to deconstruct these into their base parts. So you might realize, oh, well, this is just an example of putting a frame here, putting a wedge here. Once you can think in that sense, it's a lot easier to learn jiu-jitsu quickly because you've got a common base of knowledge that you can build on top of. So if you are struggling with remembering every little detail that your instructor has thrown at you, that might be because you're overly focused on trying to memorize things at a technique level. I would suggest, if this has described you, that you take a step back, think about things in terms of these big mental models, and then try to figure out how do all of these moves that you're learning in the gym map to these mental models. And what you'll probably find is you start realizing that a lot of the things that you like to do in jiu-jitsu, you can make them more effective by putting wedges in places to prevent your opponent's movement. That is a great canary in the coal mine for you. If your opponent is constantly moving and getting out of the things you're trying to do to them, it might be because you're not using enough blocking wedges. And similarly, if your opponent is able to put up frames that you're really struggling to get through, consider if you've got any sharp, hard parts of your body that you could use like a crowbar to pry through their defenses. So those are the two types of wedges: blocking wedges and prying wedges. I'm really enjoying doing these mini episodes. In the next 3 episodes, we're going to talk about the remaining 3 core mechanics: clamps, hooks, and posts. So again, thanks so much for all of this. Everything we make, from the podcast to the newsletter to our premium content, lives at bjjmentalmodels.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.